It depends very strongly at the local level. What kind of solidarities are there? Even in a condition when there is no government, none, zero. People don't always kill each other. Remember, I'm not making an argument here that the Poles are bad. 90% of places, or the Ukrainians are bad. 90% of places, there are all kinds of people who prevented pogroms from happening. Local priests, local doctors, all kinds of people who did the right thing. In a small percentage of places, they did do the right thing. And I think I'm on to something about the conditions under which they did not. What this tells us is that there's a certain importance to at least minimal political assimilation for preventing violence. And that second one is a trickier point, which requires more advanced social science skills. Okay, lots of time. The second point is actually an interesting point. It's a point really that applies to, I mean, this is a talk that I do a lot. I'm pretty fluent in it. I can talk about it at any level. And it's a point that I usually put up there for Holocaust historians. Most students of the Holocaust tend to look at perpetrators and victims and bystanders in terms of individual good people, not good people. Was it a good priest or a not good priest? Was it a good doctor or a bad doctor? Were the locals nice or not nice? Who rescued? Who helped? What I'm saying is that maybe we actually need to move beyond the individual level of analysis to the actual communal character. In some places, and I have lots of narratives to show this, it was simply easier for a priest to be good, or a doctor to be good, or the local lawyer who was a veterinarian to be good. And it had to do with previous existing solidarities. So most of my evidence, it's really interesting, most of my evidence for these pogroms, it consists of, I have these 7,200 testimonies that were given. I have two sources. These are interesting sources. The first source I have is the daily diaries of the SS, of the Nazis. The Einsatzgruppen reports. So I have those. I have them from the point of view of the Germans, but I also have 7,200 survivor testimonies that were taken from 1945 to 1947 at various Jewish institutes for historical research, mostly in Poland. So most of the testimonies are in Polish, Yiddish, some in Russian. And then they most of them happen, then they trickle in over the years. And in fact, they're still trickling in. They become less reliable in the present day because people have tended to see Schindler's List and they know what they're supposed to remember. But the ones from 45 to 47 are really good. The word Holocaust had not been used yet. No one knew what they were supposed to remember. They didn't know. I have some testimonies of 14-year-olds. They didn't know whether there were any children alive. So these are quite remarkable documents in and of themselves. They tend to be about 12 pages long, and they talk about, the Germans entered the village, they put up their flag. One of the famous cities, it's actually the lesser-known pogrom in a city called Szczecin in northeastern Poland. The Germans come in, they put up their flag, they push on. That night, the local Poles get together and they carry out a series of horrible massacres, which is described in these documents over and over in various places. So I'm pretty sure that's what happened. Various places and times, the same kinds of testimony given. What's really interesting about this is it's a terrible massacre. The next morning, some local Poles come to them and tell them, we're going to do it again tonight. The Jewish men have already been taken away. The Jewish women are totally panicked. They run to the village priest. The village priest says, no, I'm sorry, I can't do anything to help you. I'll be swept away by the tide myself if I do, which really proves my point, that it's a communal level phenomenon. Then they run to the doctor, still no help. They run to the various people they call from the intelligentsia, which means people like veterinarians and school teachers, no help. Then, guess what they decide to do? There's a small detachment of Germans on the outskirts of the village. soldiers, not SS, regular soldiers. And they go to the soldiers and they say, can you guys stop this? And they go, we're soldiers, we're involved in war, we're not involved in your local matters, we can't help you. And then two of the testimonies I have say, from these women, say that. And then we went back and we gave the German soldiers, this is at 7 at night, soap and coffee. Soap and coffee. The soldiers who had just invaded 3 days before, and in their rations were given soap and coffee. Whether these Jewish women also offered soap and coffee to the Polish intelligentsia remains unknown. What I do know is these women survived and the pogrom stopped in the village of Chuchit because the German soldiers stopped it. Germans stopped it. Now, a month later, the SS comes back and massacres everyone. All the remaining Jews. I'm not letting the Germans off the hook. But that's a story. That's straight from a testimony by the last point by Chaya Soika Golding. You can look it up online. It's online, that testimony. And look up the town of Chuchit. What this tells you is that all of these features are in play. Many of the people who carried out these pogroms had been imprisoned by the Soviets. There are lots of stories of peasants coming into the town with wagons to take stuff away. I get that Jew's apartment, I killed him. So there's evidence of greed at play. A mixture of motives. Revenge, greed, hatred. But what we do know, even with all those motives, even with all that mix of motives, in most places, it did not happen. It did not happen. So let me stop there and take some questions. Yes? I'm glad you brought up the communists. Very, very important. I didn't talk about it. Indeed, there is a huge difference. Remember, these are proportional representation elections, right? Highly proportional. So 12% of the vote is an excellent result. There's a gigantic difference between the communist and non-communist areas. It appears that communism is correlated with the occurrence of pogroms and non-pogroms, except exactly the opposite of what most people said. It appears that a fairly strong communist vote, and that remains statistically significant. I have a multivariate, very fancy table, which proves my point. Appears to immunize a community against pogroms. Why? Why? Think about what communism was. Now, it was nasty, it was horrible, they deported people, they did lots of murder and bad stuff. But communism, the one thing that it was a non-nationalist ideology. It was workers of the world unite, not workers of Poland unite. And it was one of the ideologies, one of the only political movements in which Jews, Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Lithuanians, there are very few Lithuanian communists actually, which is why, in fact, Lithuania has the highest percentage of pogroms in any area of Europe. 25% of all Jewish communities experience pogroms in the same area, same thing. So, the point is that I'm very happy you pointed that out. I thought I was running out of time, and so I skated over this. Communism, rather than causing pogroms, appears to have stopped it. Robustly so, in many places. So areas that had few Jews, low Zionist vote, high communist vote, low nationalist vote, were very unlikely to have a pogrom. That's the point. More questions? Yeah. Now, the question was, everybody sit still. I'll let you go in a couple minutes. Yeah, we've got 10 minutes. I'll let you go in a couple minutes. Does this have to do with economics? Because the premise of your question, this had to do with former German territories. In fact, these territories, let's go back. The former German territories were here, in this area. This area was all captured by Germany in 1939. There were no pogroms on any of those territories. These areas the Germans had never controlled. The eastern part of Poland where the pogroms occurred, they never occurred. In fact, there was the economically most backward area of Poland. Highest illiteracy rates, most agricultural. How can you just get up and leave? I mean, this is like, it's not real. If I was giving a lecture, I wouldn't get up and have to leave. I wouldn't get up and leave myself. I mean, I don't know. It's the civilizing process, I guess. She's not going to forget that. It's not all, it's rude. So you see my point, that it's not really, here's the only way in which I think it is about investment. I want to give you, because there's lots of data that I have that I didn't show you. I have data on illiteracy, which correlates very well with industrialization, right? The more industrialized the place, the less illiterate it is. It is true that the more illiterate a town was, a shtetl, with the Yiddish word for a town, the more illiterate the town was, the more likely there was to be a pogrom. Which is to say, the poorer the locals, the more they were likely probably to want to go grab stuff that other people owned. There's where I would agree with you, but it's not really a story about industrialization, because this was the poorest area of Poland. The Kresy Wschodnie, the eastern marches. Let me take another question. Yeah. When was the Holocaust word used? You can actually look that up on Wikipedia. It's a good question. The word Holocaust existed before the Holocaust, right? Why did they treat, sorry, not what I'm talking about, in general, the destruction of European Jewry? Right, because half of all Jews were killed. That's why, I mean, it was basically, sorry? Yeah, it's interesting that that's in the English-speaking community. The word, for example, in Poles, the Poles don't use the word Holocaust. And the Russians never even used the word Holocaust at all until really the 1980s. And then you know what word they adopted? Holocaust. Right? They just took the English word. Right? Violent, fiery destruction is literally what Holocaust means. So you can understand why they use that word for this, because it's interesting. I mean, what I think is kind of original about my research, what I think is original, right? I don't want to overmake too many claims about it. But what I think is original is this. The image of the Holocaust. The image of the Holocaust has largely been until now about industrial killing. You take people, you put them on trains, you send them off to places where they are put in effectively death factories. And the only thing the factory produces is corpses. It's impersonal. What I'm talking about here is far more personal. It's far more personal. It's almost intimate to the village level. People we're finding out about the Holocaust, that about half of all killings, they were done at very close range. And so that image of the Holocaust as being fiery, in a way, people have asked me, is what I'm talking about here even the Holocaust? And I say no. Because it occurred really before the Holocaust happened. It was the first couple weeks of the war, before anybody knew, before the Germans themselves knew what they were going to do. So that's why people concentrate. Yeah, last question. Oh, that's a good question. If political assimilation was very important for surviving this kind of situation, why would Israel limit itself in what it's doing in Gaza? I'm not sure I fully, that's the question you asked, right? I'm not sure I fully get the question. I'm actually saying I don't fully understand the question. Are you saying, why doesn't Israel kill each and every Palestinian? Well, I mean, they don't do it because that's not their intention. They're not the Nazis. The Nazis were intent on killing each and every Jew, and they invaded countries and systematically hunted them down. The Israelis are just not interested in doing that. What are the Israelis interested in doing? That's a separate question. Like people disagree on that question. They're probably interested at a minimum in pacifying, in the pinker sense of the word, right? In pacifying the Palestinian resistance movement, right? At a minimum. Are they interested in killing the maximum number of Palestinians? Clearly not, or else they can just kill everyone, right? That's easily done, and they don't do that. Are they interested in having those Palestinians join the Israeli community? Also clearly not. If you were there, I agree with you. They're clearly not interested in doing that, or they would have them all convert to Judaism or something like that, right? Or assimilation, right? Or they would systematically try to have them stop speaking Arabic, which they don't do. They're in Arab schools, right? But even within 367 Israel proper. Arabs tend to go to Arab schools, but they also all tend to speak Hebrew fluently as well. I taught a class last year at Hebrew University. About a third of the students I taught it 20 short courses in December. About a third of the students were Palestinian Arabs. The interesting thing is I taught this stuff. It was really interesting. You got all kinds of great arguments. The arguments you're saying. So the bottom line is that it's a different situation. This was a situation in which, I'm talking about a very limited situation in which all public authority is removed. You have mixed communities. What are the conditions under which those communities turn on each other? In Gaza, there are no mixed communities. There is not one Jew living in Gaza. Right? There is not one Jew in Gaza. Well, there may be like 2 or 3 people in Gaza City, but there's no Jewish community in Gaza. It doesn't exist. Right? So, bottom line is you don't have those conditions set up for it. You have to have mixed local communities or mixed ethnic groups in which all authority is removed. Under those conditions, then it's legitimate to ask what are the conditions under which some communities commit massacres against others. I'm not saying the Israelis didn't kill people. They did. It just wasn't this. It wasn't this. Anyway, thank you very much.